wow, nice background. Cool. All right, yeah, we'll just get started here. Well, yeah, so basically before we get like into the production, I guess, what we're gonna do is we'll just kind of have a little talk about the whole thing. We'll talk about, you seem to have a background with the whale, and then just kind of go over the introduction, or I mean like the first maybe 3 or 4 chapters of Edgar's book. And then, yeah, just kind of use that as like a broad introduction to what we want to do here. I mean, one thing is, I feel like if somebody can figure out how to really analytically dissect Moby Dick, then one, you can figure out how to dissect sort of the modern culture, and then 2, you can kind of figure out how to dissect almost any like serious book or serious movie or story or anything. So yeah, so I don't know, we'll do this one today, kind of just like a general overview in the first 3 or 4 chapters, and then yeah, we'll see from there. We'll just do like a couple more of these. So anyway, how's that sound?
Sounds fine. Yeah, I'm not really sure what to expect here, but I'm looking forward to the conversation. So
cool. Yeah, just kind of going with the flow, because that's kind of how it is with everybody. It's such a big work. It's not like, let's talk about a Disney movie or let's talk about Star Wars. It's such a big, important foundational work, especially for American literature. So
the problem I have more than anything is I don't know when to shut up about it. So
okay, yeah, that's fine. Well, we'll just cut the tape in about 90 minutes. Okay, so all right, we'll get into it. So I am recording live with Chad Beck, and Chad, I came across on Facebook groups as I wanted somebody to talk to about a specific book that we're going to get into today, which is actually, we're going to sort of do a commentary on a commentary, which is Melville's Moby Dick, but it's, how do you say this, Chad? American Nikia?
yes, is how I say it. I don't know if that's correct, but
okay. So yeah, so it's like the great American mythology, or the real great American novel, and it's really important, especially to modern or maybe even postmodern culture, or even American Gothic and so many other genres. And like I was saying a minute ago before we sort of started, what will be the production is, if we can figure out how to really dissect Moby Dick and the symbolism and everything else in it, like we'll start to today, then we can understand almost any work of art these days, as far as literature or stories or films or anything. But Chad, I just know that you have a background where you said you've read Moby Dick several times. You've read this book by Edward F. Edinger, and it sort of made you an amateur Jungian. So that's mostly what I know about you. So I thought you'd be a good person to talk to for the first time getting into this. And then we're going to do more of these in the future, probably about once a month for, I don't know, maybe 3 months or so. But anyway, just tell us a little bit more about you and your background and how you kind of became obsessed with Moby Dick.
yeah, well, that so I guess I'll just start by saying, I don't have, I'm not like an American literature background or anything like that. I graduated from college actually with a degree in philosophy and computer science. So, but I belong to a number of book clubs. There's a lot of books I've sort of read over the years, a lot of classics. But I just picked this one up almost somewhat randomly. It's like, it's been it just felt, it's a neglected book, right? Like here's one of these things I felt obligated to read it at some point in my life, and I sort of picked it up. It immediately sort of surprised me, not only just by how beautifully it was written, but also like how funny it is. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a dark sense of humor that kind of runs throughout it, and it immediately kind of threw me off kilter. But as I read the book, I always had certain expectations, right? Everyone kind of knows the plot of Moby Dick.
Right.
And I felt like it was constantly sort of disappointing what my expectations were.
Yeah.
And when I finished reading it, it was just this nagging feeling that wouldn't leave me. It was something that just always in the back of my mind since the first time I read it. Like, what did I just read? And it presented itself as a kind of puzzle to me, right? It just more and more it started to obsess me and kind of occupy more and more of my thought space. And this was, I only read it for the first time, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago now, something like that. And I've read it. I've actually lost track of how many times I've read it since then, but I stopped counting at some point. Even to the degree where, like, I read it at one point in what I call it memento order. If you've seen the movie Memento, how it starts,
like kind of
starts at the
backwards
end and then goes forward. So I read it, basically I started at chapter 135 and worked my way backwards.
Interesting.
So just to, it's a way of kind of doing it to kind of, make some of the connections.
Right.
You tend to read it in a certain way, and then you kind of get into a habit of maybe emphasizing certain parts in your mind over others. It's just a way of sort of breaking up my habit and looking at it in a whole new way. And the Edinger book in particular, this is one of the commentaries that I read that really spoke to me in terms of, the Jungian approach to this book. And I have my share of disagreements with what Edinger says in certain points.
Okay.
I'll try not to get too nerdy about any of it, but
no, that's okay. We can get nerdy.
But what I was very impressed by, there's certain things which I think he really got right, and kind of shaped. I don't know. It's hard for me to remember exactly, my own kind of progress and development, and then how my interpretation of Moby Dick has changed exactly, and what was what. But I've always, this has been one of my favorite commentaries on Moby Dick that I've read. And
so you've read a few of them?
Yeah, I've read a number of, a lot of just different essays, different books. Yeah, it's, it just, despite my sort of, I call them nitpicks with the book, I think it's broadly, it has a very powerful sort of way of dealing with Moby Dick that really appealed to me.
Well, so what's interesting about that is you and I are kind of coming at it from two different angles, which is you're coming at it from the Moby Dick angle, and I'm coming at it kind of from the Jungian angle, where I've read a lot of Carl Jung, and in the process, one thing that kind of stuck out to me is, I forget exactly where he said it, but he said that, Moby Dick is the great American novel. I think it was in his essay on art and literature, which can be found in Modern Man in Search of a Soul. But, and then the reason that's important is because so many of the psychological and cultural issues that we've been dealing with for the last, at least since the inception of America until now, are still, being worked out in the sort of cultural psyche or whatever. And to understand this book, Moby Dick, is to understand America and modern culture, as well as, all the art and literature that have, come within the genre in the last few years, or a couple centuries, roughly speaking. And so that's kind of my approach. And then, yeah, what I found is just going over Edinger's approach. He dissects it almost exactly like Carl Jung would dissect dreams, but also Carl Jung did some seminars like he did, like maybe one of the more famous ones is the one on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and he did some other ones that were on stories and dreams, but basically he did a lot of work where he would sort of take apart stories like he would interpret dreams, which is really important, because if you understand the way that symbols just kind of fall into the cultural psyche or the mind of the artist, and then presented to the culture, and then like actually enveloped into the art and into the culture, it's like that. It's like the interaction that we have between our unconscious mind or our dream world and our lived reality. Another book, by the way, I'm gonna get into actually with some Clubhouse people on that app, is it's kind of a similar one in that approach. It's Neuromancer, which is, I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's the one that was kind of inspired The Matrix, and it's very similar, and it's a visionary art, and that's really what this is. It's a visionary work. So yeah, so I guess to kind of dive into it, I was really, for me, sometimes, like most people, I think sometimes I would get a lot of these 19th century authors mixed up between like Hemingway and Melville and one or two others, and some of their books like Old Man and the Sea. But it was really interesting in the first chapter of this book to get into Melville. And what I find interesting there, and it'd be interesting to hear what you find interesting about Melville's background, but he was at sea for a few years. Like, this is largely from his own personal experience. And what's interesting about that is he could have just written almost like a documentary type thing on being at sea, but it's kind of one of these things where it's like fiction that's in a way truer than nonfiction, because it's like distilled to its sort of like symbolic and most archetypal form. But yeah, so can you tell us anything about, as we kind of like start to get into chapter 1 of Edinger's book, can you tell us anything what you think about his approach to Melville and Melville's background?
Well, there's a number of things you touched on. One is, that one almost throwaway line by Jung about this is the greatest novel ever written, right? And it's, I more than anything, I regret that he hadn't said more about that, right? Like, I wish he had just written his own commentary on it, but I guess this is the closest we'll ever get to it.
Right.
The idea, I mean, there's two things that really kind of got me excited about what you said, is the idea of truth, right?
Right.
I don't think Edinger makes it a big deal of it, at least not to the degree that I do, but the idea of truth comes up in a number of places in Moby Dick. The most significant one is when he talks about Queequeg. And he says, he's describing the island that Queequeg originates from. And at one place it's called Cocovoco, and another place it's called Rocovoco. So it's there's already a sort of contradiction you have to deal with. But the contradictions are very interesting to me, and I think that they're not. I think they're significant in the sense that, starting from I would say from the place of, we have really an unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
And we can get into the significance of that a little bit later, but in terms of relating the unreliableness of the narrator to this higher notion of truth, I think that there is a distinction that Melville draws. It's very implicit, and it's something that it's really, from a careful reading, I think you can get out of it. But what he means by truth is different from something that you might regard as merely factual. So the quote I had in mind is where he says, it's not down on any map. No true places ever are. And so that there's the notion of something which is literally, it's a literal fact, and it's
material fact.
There's an island. It's been mapped and it's been recorded, and but there's something which is untrue about that, right? There's something which is less than true. So I think that's an interesting distinction to keep in mind, because I think it speaks a lot to what I think is the overriding, or at least one of the motivations for, I guess, in terms of Ishmael's quest, if we're going to talk about it that way, right? So what are the things that kind of set the parameters of what's the correct way to read this? And I think if we go to chapter, we're talking about chapter 1, and Edinger kind of outlines these two different ways of interpreting. And you described one. Well, one is sort of this biographical approach, right? And that to me is more in the realm of what I'm terming fact here, right? So it's these are the particulars of Melville's life, which sort of give rise to this, what I'm calling the realm of truth, which is really more the universal. So, in Edinger's approach, he's trying to merge the two. And now he puts a little bit more emphasis on Melville's biography than I even care to. I'm much less interested in the particular than the universal in that sense, because I do feel like the particular, it depends on how you deal with it, right? But it can be used to kind of to alienate you almost from the text, right? Because if you can just say to yourself, well, of course he would write that way because he had an abusive father, whatever it is, in a way that makes it just particular to him as a person, as opposed to the thing which really makes it meaningful in a universal way to everybody, right? Because these are all experiences, even if you haven't had maybe his upbringing or whatever the case may be, we still are able to recognize something of that in ourselves, right? In the sense that we're, there's at least a potentiality, like this is something that humanity, it's one aspect of humanity, right? This notion of, say, a broken household or something like that.
I guess the distinction to make there, and I called chapter 1 Melville the Man, but technically Edgar calls chapter 1 introduction.
Yeah, it's a little confusing.
But
probably the introduction is before chapter.
Well, but one thing he gets at there, and it's a short introduction, is it's almost like distinguishing a Freudian interpretation from a Jungian interpretation, in that the Freudian interpretation, which sometimes people that don't understand that Jung Freud contrast, where Jung largely agrees with Freud on almost everything, but the problem is that Freud basically stops at the level of personal consciousness and personal unconscious, whereas Jung goes deeper down into the level of the collective psyche or the collective unconscious. And so what you were talking about is kind of getting into that point where you mentioned how Edinger talks about you can look at this a couple different ways. So you can look at it in a particular way to the experience of Melville, which is how a lot of people interpret art. They just kind of like interpret it according to the experience of that individual, et cetera, et cetera. But what's more true in a way is the universal symbolism, the sort of like touching between the collective unconscious and the collective consciousness, or the zeitgeist of society, as it's called. And it's universal. And what you're saying about that quote on, what was that quote about the map?
It's not done on any map. No true places ever are.
Right. So what that makes me think of is almost like, I think Heraclitus said, no man steps in the same river twice. And what he's getting at there, and there's a few other variations on that type of quote, but what that's getting at is that, and I think it goes on to say it's not the same river and it's not the same man, but it's that when we think things are the same things, like whether that it is a island or a body of water, which maybe we'll get into later, or all these other material things, that's not only not true, it's a fantasy at best, because what they really are is their processes, whether we're talking about material objects or people or anything. And so the truth is in the process. It's sort of the archetypal process truth that comes out of human experience, to get to kind of the point of, like we're talking about, Edinger's talking about two different ways to analyze this. Yeah, a lot of people analyze these things even from a psychological view, more of like the Freudian, let's look at the person's childhood and that kind of thing. And yeah, it's like he had a troubled upbringing and those kind of things, but we all kind of do it in different ways. It's like, even if we have a perfect upbringing, so to speak, we'll find other problems because that's just how we are. But yeah, to kind of like the point I was making about like nonfiction, or I mean, fiction being sometimes truer than nonfiction, it's that, he distilled down his years of experience, where Melville was actually a seaman, and he distilled it down to like the truest experiences. And he was a little bit educated as a writer, but not like immensely like a lot of other writers at that time. So he's mostly writing off of the experience, and in that sort of like experiential writing, and not just trying to like pull from ideas of the time or symbols or whatever, but just kind of like writing out of almost like an unconscious state. He pulled out symbolism that it stuck because it's part of like what the culture is going through. Another story that comes to mind, I read Emma Young's book on the Grail legend that was actually finished by Marie-Louise von Franz. And she's talking about how the Grail legend was kind of like that shift between the epochs, or like the middle of roughly 1,000 years ago, where it was kind of like that shift between the middle of the Middle Ages. And I would say there's a few stories that are basically the same thing for this modern epoch, modern world going into the postmodern world, which is, this is like a transitional story of going from sort of the pre-modern world, or whatever you want to call it, because it was at the time when it was like, people were getting oil for kerosene lamps. It was at the time when they were in the middle of abolishing slavery worldwide and all those things. So it was a transitional period that we're still, dealing with. So all these symbols are coming from the unconscious of Melville into the book, and it sticks over the course of not just that time. Like at that time, it wasn't even very well received. It was like moderately well received. People were more into his previous book, Type P, or how do you say it? Type P, or
Yeah, Type E.
yeah. So they were more into that book just because it was like a book about being with primitives and cannibals and all those kinds of things. Whereas people didn't really get this book until years later when the symbolism started to make a lot of sense. But yeah, so what are some of your other thoughts as far as the introduction, how this symbolism started to get absorbed from the artist into the sort of culture?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Type E, and I think that's even that book kind of it's supposedly biographical or autobiographical, or actually even that book is written from perspective of a fictional character. But it's clear that that was a formative experience for Melville, right? So like this notion of this concept of cannibalism, right, which runs throughout Moby Dick. So Queequeg is obviously the sort of symbol of the cannibal king,
Mm-hmm.
and he plays this hugely important role in the book, right? And so yeah, there's kind of what you're saying before, and there's the Melville quote that he says, "The whale ship was my Harvard and my Yale." Right?
Yeah.
So much of it, he is sort of an autodidact, really, more than anything else, and a lot of that does have to do with his background, right? So he basically his father had sort of mismanaged a bunch of funds and stuff, and had and so the family was going broke. He had to be pulled out of school, all this sort of thing, and it does start to touch on I guess I can connect it back to some of what you were saying earlier, right? About what does it mean, this distinction between fact and truth that I've kind of proposed without, perhaps I haven't explained it sufficiently, and I don't know if I need to, but maybe it'll just come out through the course of the conversation. But if you're just going to school just to memorize a bunch of
right.
You're just trying to regurgitate information that's being fed to you,
right.
which is sort of the problem. I don't know how different schools were back then, but that's sort of the criticism that you have of school nowadays, right? You're fed an answer and then you're asked to repeat it, right? And if you can do that well enough, then you'll get a good grade.
Yeah.
But what he's really doing, I would say, Melville is essentially challenging that. Even so, I think this is one of my pet peeves, I guess, with interpretations of Moby Dick, is that they tend to even skip over. So they go straight to chapter 1, and actually that's not where the book begins. So
where's the book begin?
Well, there's a chapter called Extracts, and then there's a little chapter called Etymology. And Extracts, and people never complain about Extracts. I think they just don't read it. Among people that don't like Moby Dick, they always complain about chapter 32, which is the cetology chapter. But there's, which I don't even think Edinger discusses in here. Maybe he mentions it, but the Extracts is this very, again, it'll set you off guard immediately, because you don't know what is Melville even doing here. But it's essentially, it's all these different quotes from random books, and they're all just kind of thrown together in a way that, my reaction when I read this is it's very disorienting. All these things are taken out of context. Sometimes they contradict each other. So it's almost like this buzzing noise of different voices, right? It's a cacophony.
He's talking about whales, basically, right?
Most of them are about whales in one capacity or another. Yeah. Some of them, some of them are, like, say, drawn from mythology, or some of them could be you know, just there's a quote, for instance, from, you know, Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, and then, you know, it actually kind of starts, actually give an overall sketch of what the extracts look like. It really starts with the book of Genesis.
Mhm.
And, you know, in the same sort of way in which, you know, in Genesis, the world is formed out of formlessness, right? You sort of
Mhm.
have this opening chapter, which is formless in a certain way. And then
Mhm.
throughout the book, it actually draws from this sort of material, and
Mhm.
it kind of, you know, sketches it all together, or stitches it all together to actually form a story out of it eventually.
That's funny. When I went over that chapter, I thought it was just added after the fact. I didn't even realize it was like from Melville. Like I thought it was one of those things that sometimes people add after the fact, like an appendix or something.
I have a weird obsession with this chapter. I feel like
Okay.
it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it doesn't get a whole lot of discussion, and I don't know to what degree it
Okay.
informs people's interpretation of the book. But for
Mhm.
me, it's hugely meaningful. Um,
Yeah.
and you know, I think I guess I'm trying to address your question about what's sort of the sort of cultural, and you know, Edinger talks about Melville's crisis, right? This
Mhm.
crisis of faith. And, you know, I see immediately the symbolism that's happening straight out in the extracts chapter, where you basically have, you know, all of these, and the extracts are at one point even associated with religion. You know, he says they're not to be taken as gospel cetology, for instance, right? So
Mhm.
there's already an association being made that there's something sort of religious about these extracts. And yet
Yeah.
it's, you know, if you think about it, maybe in terms of, you know, the second great awakening, right, which
Mhm.
is happening around this time. So again, there's
Yeah.
this maybe whole cacophony of voices, and there's this crisis of faith, really, right, because
Right.
you don't know who to listen to.
Right.
And ultimately the answer is going to be, you know, this is kind of the spoiler alert for the for the book, is that, you know, you have to find the answer within yourself.
Right. Yeah. It reminds me of what Jung was trying to do, and Marie Louise von Franz doesn't typically get enough credit because she met him when she was like 18 or 19, and then she went and got her education in classical languages, mainly Latin. And so basically, what he was trying to do is similar to what Melville was putting together in a different way, which was put together a psychology um, based off of history and mythology, which is similar to what it seems that Melville was trying to do, based on a number of things, based on history, mythology, uh, religion, all these things, and then put it together. Then in the process, you put it together, and at first it's incoherent, and then it becomes more coherent, and then you're kind of left with this symbolic task of dealing with it, which that is really interesting. That, and yeah, I did kind of like gloss over the extracts chapter. Now I've got to go back and dig into it. But it almost makes me think of, like, as we try to deal with our past as individuals and as culture, almost like you would do in in therapy. You know, at first it's very incoherent. Like if you go through therapy, at first you're just going to get all these like incoherent pieces about your life and history and culture, and try to put it all together in a coherent narrative. Um, Same thing, I would assume, as Melville went through these experiences with these whale ships and such, and he then tried to make it make sense in terms of historical mythology and religious experiences, and I guess that's what he was trying to do there. And it always makes me think of the what was it? There's a lot of other whale mythology throughout history, as I'm sure you know, throughout especially more primitive cultures, especially like Native American cultures, and which is a lot of how um, Pinocchio came about. And I mentioned that because Jordan Peterson always famously talks about rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. And he's specifically talking about what Pinocchio does, but as that we unpack that symbolism, what's going on there is it's talking about reviving the tradition in the past. Well, I mean, it's something that's almost impossible to verbalize, the task that's going on there. Like Melville was basically on that task, which was to revive the spirit of our ancestors, basically, or our dying religion, not just Christianity, but even more primitive religion, in that it was humanity for all known history behaved more like Queequeg, the primitive shadow, as Melville calls them. And so what Melville was attempting to do, among other things, is to revive that part of our psyche, or even collective psyche. But what do you think?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways of approaching this, right? One,
okay,
we can maybe introduce some other characters into the story of Moby Dick.
Okay.
If we want to sort of stick to the extracts chapter, I would point out, we have this character, this sub librarian, this pale usher, threadbare in coat, heart, body, and brain, right?
Interesting.
So he's sort of this, he's an usher, even in the sense of he's kind of this, he's kind of a holder of the keys. So he's, insofar as he's representing these extracts, he's this sort of, I guess what I'm trying to say, he's this sort of sickly character. You read the description of him, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's almost like a living dead character, right?
Right.
And he kind of represents, to me, insofar as we associated with all these extracts, he represents sort of greater culture at large. So he's, in a way, he's transmitting all this cultural knowledge,
right?
And yet at the same time, there's a vitality that's lacking there, right? So it is a sort of there's a hollowness to it, right? And so the question that presents itself, as us, I would say us as readers, is like, how do we win back that vitality, right? So we have to sort of, it's not so much about sort of having a blind worship for culture or anything like that,
right?
And and I think I'll bring in Queequeg eventually, right? Because Queequeg is unique in the role that he plays in the story, because he's so far outside of all culture, right? He's this primitive who's completely natural and sort of, he's at home in the world in a way which is completely opposite of what the sub librarian is, right? So in fact, this, the sub librarian, he's almost dead before his time, and and then you see later on in the book, Queequeg is just able to he's able to just come back to life sort of spontaneously at one point. I don't know if you've read the whole thing, but
he's like the Lazarus character.
Yeah, right. So these characters, I think it's very useful to maybe even pick characters at random and sort of compare and contrast them, right? But this is one way that you could sort of compare. One of the themes that runs throughout this book, I would say, is there's different ways of characterizing it, but I usually call it like decolonization, something like that. So, there's, if you remember the chapter Fast Fish and Loose Fish, right? He talks that the chapter ends in this, so he's just really just talking about sort of the way that that whales are sort of captured at sea, and then there's these sort of disputes about who owns what particular whale, right? If one person speared him versus another boat speared him. But the way the chapter ends is he basically addresses the audience directly, right? And he says, he has these categories of fast fish and a loose fish, which is essentially a fish, a fish which is waiting to be caught and a fish which has been caught, right? Significantly too, I think there's not a third category, which is like a fish which, is just free, right? He's not free. He's either waiting to be caught or he's going to be caught or he has been caught already, right? But he ends the chapter by addressing the reader directly. He says, "You too are a fast fish and a loose fish," right? So he talks about he starts with the particular, right? Again, this is, insofar as the story is about whaling per se, it almost has no interest for me, right? Because I'm not a whaler. Like, none of these obscure sort of rules of whaling apply to me, right? But he takes it from the particular and kind of blows it up into the universal at the end.
Right.
And really what he's talking about is, again, this notion that not only there's definitely a political dimension to this, right? If we're thinking about the context of Moby Dick, sort of leading up to the American Civil War, right? So it definitely has that connotation that he's referring to, this notion of slavery. But even at a broader sense than that, he's referring to the way that we're all enslaved, and sometimes we even enslave ourselves, right, through our own ideas. So I'm trying to connect this back, I guess, to the extracts chapter. If
okay.
And I don't know, maybe you can cut me off if I'm just rambling too much, but yeah. So it's the way I read that extracts chapter is it does come down to this sort of notion that everyone's trying to make a fast fish of you, right, from the moment you're born. And how do you sort of decolonize yourself from all of that and learn a sort of inner freedom?
Yeah. Sidebar for a second. Technical note. In a couple of minutes, I'll have to edit this out for the production. But in a couple of minutes, I'll have to take a break for just a couple minutes because I'm getting a delivery that I didn't think I would have to sign for or anything, but apparently I'm going to. So there's just a sidebar there. We'll be here in about like 3 minutes. But so yeah, it's a little tricky. It makes me think of how to order the psyche, because ordering the psyche is like it has all these divisions, and then you're trying to put it within a unity. And the individual is like a microcosm of the cosmos, or the whole of nature and human nature as a whole. And so that's why it goes into all these divisions of these characters, of course, these different boats, and then their goals of catching Moby Dick, catching whales and fish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just because all that is just symbolism for the human condition. And there's a lot in the extracts. I think maybe we'll get more into that next time, only because I'm kind of like okay, pause for a moment. Hello? Sorry about that. I ordered it. I had to get a new iPhone, and apparently they need a signature. So I think he's here, and that'll only take me a minute. 1 second. Okay, I'll be right back. Okay, I'm still waiting for him. Sorry, I thought he said 15 minutes ago he'd be here in 15 minutes, and then I thought I got a call from him. The delivery guy. I was gonna have to stand for it. But okay, so again, I might have to take a break for a minute in a minute, but we can start to get into, since we're gonna do a little character bouncing around, we can start to kind of get into the idea of Ishmael, since he's sort of the main character, which is chapter 3 in Edgar's book, and he calls him Ishmael, the alienated one, which is an underappreciated character in this character of our biblical and mythological characters of sort of like contentious brothers or hostile brothers. And interestingly, he's sort of like the first hostile brother, if you look at it in that sort of a historical patriarchal sense. And what's also interesting about that one in particular is it not only goes all the way back to the beginning of Western religion, but it also comes all the way up to our modern conflicts between, you know, the conflicts in the Middle East today. I was doing a podcast a few weeks ago, and I was discussing the sort of archetypal pattern that Jordan Peterson put forward in his most recent book, 12 More Rules for Life. And he was talking about the archetypal individual being divided into that pair of hostile brothers. And so then I kind of went on a little rant about all the hostile brothers in the Bible leading up to what we deal with today in our culture and what we have dealt with throughout. And it's just right down the heart of every individual. So what I find interesting, though, is that we have Ishmael, the alienated one, who's kind of like the opposite of the ideal, almost like the trickster or the villain in a way. He's not the ideal, he's the alienated one. But we don't really have an ideal character in this sort of like opposite of the archetypal individual. So what do you think of that aspect? Or is that just kind of left to our imagination to project on things like Ahab or some other individuals?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't read the Jordan Peterson book.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm just talking about like in general the archetypal pattern of the individual being, dissected into sort of like the ideal hero individual and the opposite, more of like the alienated or rejected individual, Ishmael in this case.
Right. I mean, it's I think Edinger's right to sort of highlight. Obviously, this book starts essentially with this archetype character.
Right.
It says, "Call me
Alienated.
Ishmael," and it doesn't even say my name is Ishmael or anything like that, right? So
Right.
you don't really even know that much about him. Again, maybe harkening back to that distinction between truth and fact, right? So
Right.
if we're trying to piece together what a biography of his character is, he's not forthcoming about it, right? His biography is really it's his self-perception that he's giving you in this point, right? So this is,
Right.
he identifies in some way with this Ishmael character, but it's not who we would say that who he is, right? Like if you were to ask if you met him along the way. In terms of, I mean, your question is about the hero. It's like, who's the hero?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about it, it's almost like Ishmael, the protagonist or the main character, it's hard to say if he is like an anti-hero in a way, or he's definitely what Edinger calls the alienated one, or if he is sort of like the everyman archetype, or just someone that anyone and everyone can identify with, or if it's just that we can identify with him because he is alienated, like we all kind of are alienated in a way. But often hero type dramas or stories with a main character, that the character will be more of an ideal rather than the alienated one. And then usually when there's the ideal hero, there's the anti-hero who's sort of alienated. And so what's interesting with this that you don't really see often in literature is they have the alienated one as the main character, and there's not really an opposite. Like sometimes in literature, if there's an alienated, then there's the ideal who's kind of their opposite in a way. Edgar gives the example when he's talking about the alienated one of Melville's own life, how he was sort of alienated within his own family, and his brother, I don't even know how to say his brother's name, but his brother was kind of like this ideal figure and just like this political leader, and always in this sort of like ideal position of the family, all the way up until he introduced Melville to a publisher, and then shortly thereafter he died, and then that's when Melville kind of became a little bit famous as a writer between Typee and publishing Moby Dick. So yeah, I guess sort of like what I'm wondering is like, usually there's an opposite to the main character. Well, we don't really have that. And so the opposite would be, rather than an alienated one, the ideal. So I don't know if maybe the ideal for the non-alienated is Ahab, just because he's kind of like someone that everybody looks up to in a way. But I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, the easy one to pick out from me would be Queequeg, right? He's in this almost superhuman character, right? Who's, yeah, and he's so self-sufficient. And you mentioned you mentioned Jung's reading of Zarathustra before, right? But like,
yeah,
he has this almost Nietzschean character about him, right? He's almost a Zarathustra in a sort of way, and he's so self-sufficient that he doesn't look to any particular person for support or anything like that, right? And he's almost got this supernatural power over life and death, and he's just so capable of anything that he does. But when I think in terms of Moby Dick of the hero of the story, I definitely, think of the hero's journey sort of thing, right? Because
Right.
the way this starts out is in this Dante-esque form, right? So
Right.
you have this character who's sort of lost on the path to life.
Right.
And whereas Dante is kind of going further and further into the forest, we have
Mhm.
Ishmael who's going closer and closer to the sea, right? And
Mhm.
so we have this, we haven't talked really about the sea and what that all represents. I mean, some of it is it's somewhat obvious, right?
Mhm.
But this is a symbol that Melville builds up throughout the novel,
Right.
right? The sea it's the realm of the unknown, right? It's
Right.
all the things that are sort of hidden and suppressed, the things that we're almost afraid to confront.
Mhm.
And the story starts out, he's essentially he's wandering, he's really just sort of following his impulses, right? And if he makes the comment how if you just kind of set somebody on a random street, they'll eventually find their way down to a wharf, right? So like
Mhm.
there's some draw to the sea that we're supposed to be
Right.
attentive to, right? And Ishmael's kind of following this impulse, and he's going, and the closer and closer he gets to the sea, like the darker things get, right? It becomes more and more nightmarish, even as
Mhm.
he gets closer to the sea.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sea and water, and basically, I think chapter 1 of the book of Moby Dick is talking a lot about um, sea symbolism or water symbolism throughout history. It's almost like extracts in a different way. Chapter 1 of the actual book, and what he's talking, he gives the example of what Narcissus and a bunch of these other ones, but I think the obvious is just that it's at the edge of, at the edge of the known territory, the edge of the explored territory, and underneath that is the territory in which we can sort of like float along the top of, but underneath that is like a whole other world, including things we want to pull out and things that we want to sort of like banish or have nothing to do with, which is sort of like, the unconscious mind. I mean, again, it kind of almost brings to mind the Freudian versus Jungian approach, whereas, Freud was just only looking at things from a personal unconscious level, like all that really matters is what happened, from a person's birth and etc. Whereas Jung didn't necessarily negate that, but he said, yes, that's true, but there's a lot more on the collective level, or sort of inherited psyche, or inherited images, or inherited symbolism, our primitive images that are given within us, and those are always in the depths. And those in the depths are these symbols, including the biggest one is probably what Jung would call the self, and this is a little bit jumping ahead and some of the symbolism of Edinger and some other things, but Jung would call what's symbolized by the whale as the self. Basically, well, and he even gets into it in chapter 1 that we're just mentioning, in that it's the ungraspable phantom, he calls it, that we see in the water. And that's sort of what Ahab sees in the whale, but what Ahab is probably more upset about is human limitation, and his hatred for human limitation puts him on this, what Melville calls this monomaniacal path, meaning that he's just like so dead set on this one thing, which is to get revenge on this one creature. And yeah, it's kind of strange, and it's a little bit like incoherent, but probably rightfully so, in that, normally especially in like modern movies, it's very straightforward as far as like who the hero is and why they're heroic, and who the villain is and why. Whereas this, we know Ishmael's the main character that we start and end with, but the other characters, as far as like who we're rooting for or who is the best or who's ideal, it's a little bit unclear. And I think that's sort of on purpose, in that if it was more clear, well, it's just that the individual and the collective psyche is that way. It's not as coherent as we might want it to be. And so there's some almost intentional discoherence there, because, well, also just the fact that the individual really is a collective. Like it's like you and me and any individual. We're not just like, we can't completely identify with any one character in a story like this. We really identify with the collection of characters in some way. And so as we try to do that, it's ordering our own psyche. Like Jung often talks about, if you're going to understand a work of art like this, for example, you can't just understand it intellectually like we're almost trying to do now. We have to be affected by it, which is, it's almost like an analytical work or a therapy. Like if you went into therapy, for example, you kind of like pull everything out from the depths that you can, and then it's going to be completely disordered, but then you have to try to put an ordering narrative in it, which is kind of like what happens in the story. But the main character is not any of the characters in the story. The main character is always the reader. So if the reader reads the story intensely, like we're trying to do, then it's one that can redeem the individual, who is whoever the reader is, and it can redeem the culture, which is kind of like what we're after. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so, well, in terms of the main character, so one I would say maybe misreading of this story is that Ahab is the main character. So what we see, there's sort of interesting ways this story kind of can be divided up. When we started out, it's very much, we have Ishmael as an active participant in the world. You see him going to places and talking to people. At some point, I think chapter 16, I think, he sort of just disappears, right? He no longer becomes an active character. He's still the narrator throughout the whole thing, and he's clearly imposing his own interpretation, his own personality upon things. So he's never absent from the story in that sense, but he no longer becomes kind of the locus of all the action, right? So instead, what sort of happens is, at some point, Ahab appears, and he's such a powerful magnetic character that all your attention gets drawn to him immediately. He's just this larger than life, another sort of archetype, right? Who's just absolutely fascinating to just listen to and observe. And so Ishmael kind of falls away. He sort of disappears into the story at some point. But I think there's significance to that. And so what you're talking about is, how do you identify? You don't identify with any particular character, but I do think what Edinger says is really the important point, in that all of these characters are in some way or another, manifestations of the self, or and so to me, like, Ishmael doesn't really disappear so much as he maybe disperses into these other characters.
Right.
One of the criticisms of Melville, and I'd say Moby Dick, is that sometimes the characters come off as a little bit cartoonish, right?
Mm-hmm.
They maybe don't seem fully fleshed out characters. They're just a little bit too exaggerated in certain respects.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that speaks to their sort of archetypal nature, right? And the
Right.
sort of dream logic that he's really dealing with in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something here again, kind of coming back to that truth and fact distinction that I'm making, right? There's sort of this higher um, there's a higher sense in which we're supposed to be interpreting these characters.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jung, again, Modern Man's Search of a Soul. He talks about the stages of life, and sort of in the stages of life, you go through these, you're one person, and Nietzsche talks about this too, by the way, but just in a different, more poetic terms, where he, says first you're a camel, then you're a lion, and then you become like a child for the first time when you're an old person. But basically, Jung talks about, there's a difference between a young adult and then there's sort of a breaking that happens in the midlife usually. And the way that happens is leading up to that point, you're in basically in your late 20s, early 30s, roughly. You're on your life's mission, and that life's mission is maybe your career or whatever. But then, which actually is one thing that I think is really interesting, and this is kind of like jumping ahead to the end, but I feel like the story kind of ends in the middle. It kind of ends kind of like archetypally as like a person's, as kind of like in the middle of archetypally or culturally, the middle of a midlife crisis or surviving a midlife crisis, or maybe you could just call it like when a person kind of like has their awakening, takes their red pill, or becomes sort of conscious or enlightened for the first time in their life, is where it kind of ends. And it gets there by basically you identify with Ahab because Ahab is in a way not like an ideal, like the hero is typically the ideal, but sort of like a cultural ideal, or the imperial ideal, you might say. I was listening to somebody recently who was sort of doing a short Jungian commentary on Moby Dick, and saying how imperialism is almost like the human ego put out upon Earth. It's there to kind of like just take over everything, which is kind of how the human ego can kind of be. And a lot of this story is kind of representing that. It's like sort of a quest for dominance, quest that Ahab won't submit to anything. He won't yield to anything. He won't be ruled by anything. And he needs to rule the one thing that broke him, which another interesting Disney parallel comes to mind. He's a lot like Captain Hook and Peter Pan, in that, he's after the crocodile with the clock inside of him, because the crocodile has a piece of him, which is time inside the crocodile, which is kind of after everyone, everyone's mortality. But then it's also got a piece of Captain Hook, which is why it's the hook, which is very similar to Ahab now having his leg replaced by a whalebone. So it's kind of like the person who is most into that sort of like imperial ideal in a way, almost like I don't know. I'm trying to think of like a better example than Trump, but Trump does come to mind. Not that I'm necessarily a supporter or anti, but that imperial ideal, and that he's almost like a the person who can go out and get the thing that the current culture wants the most, which the current culture then wanted most, whales and whale oil. And so he was kind of like that strange hero in that way. But I don't know, what do you think?
Well, just a side note, J.M. Barrie, I think it was consciously modeled on Ahab and Moby Dick.
Oh yeah.
So so it's interesting that you picked up on that. But yeah, I think what Ahab's essential conflict is, I think, what you said, right? It's his own limitation, it's his own sense of vulnerability, right? There's lots of ways, sort of secular and religious, you can interpret that, right? So one way is it's a form of a sort of original sin, right? We're kind of born into this world, and we're limited, right? We're going to die, and so you can sort of take the denial of death sort of approach to this, right? It's all about he's not able to reconcile himself to the notion of his own finitude, right? And and that manifests in all sorts of ways, right? Not just the fact that we're not immortal beings, but we don't know everything. And in Ahab's particular case, obviously, it's that wounding which he's sort of fixated on, right? And so that kind of sets the context for which we can interpret his character, right? He has a certain self-image of himself, which has now been challenged, right? He sort of sees himself as this conqueror of whales, and yet he's been defeated in some sense.
Right.
And so now he thinks he can sort of repair the situation, right? There's certainly no rational route to what he's trying to do, but in his own mind, he thinks that by destroying the whale, he can get his own wholeness back, right?
Yeah, wholeness is the key word, because in Jungian terms, we call this the individuation process. And individuation, the ultimate goal is to achieve wholeness, but you really do so by yielding to the whatever you want to call it, the psyche, the universe, whatever, even God, in some sense. But that's sort of like, well, and another thing that's interesting, we can always get into some of the religious connotation, but the time period of this is really interesting in that it was kind of like the dying age of see, the Christianity thing is a tough thing to get at, because in a way, the culture is still very Christian even today. But up until approximately Darwin, the Christianity mindset of everyone just kind of like accepting that almost as fact was the way that it was. But it was still kind of like in the process of dying out in the culture. Like, people were speaking the way that Darwin spoke, like for at least a century before that there would be some kind of natural order that brought about humanity rather than this cosmic creator God. But so the time in which that this was written, the time and place and setting and everything else is really important, because it was kind of like a sort of transition of the epoch of Christianity, all while sort of still our primitive roots holding on to us, in that, back at that time we still had a lot of more primitive cultural influence, like now it's a lot harder to find these primitive cultures like that are talked about in this book, and but those were pretty pretty common still at that time, where you would have like Queequeg was a Maori, which is what we now know as native to New Zealand. And so that was a lot more common then. So you had the like primitive influence, and you basically all these various religious influences sort of ever present and ever in the mind of everyone. Whereas Ahab kind of represents the opposite, which is like, rather than submit to primitive thoughts or submit to religious thinking or even symbolic thinking, he's got to do it his way, and he's got to be in control of everything. So it's kind of that tension of those opposites. Someone like Ishmael, who's kind of just wanted to find surrender to things, compared to Ahab, who's the opposite and wants to control everything. So that's the other sort of dynamic there, is sort of the atheism religion versus the typical religious religion.
Right. So, you mentioned Darwin, but, the fragmentation, the religious fragmentation occurred, prior to that, the Protestant Reformation. So, I mentioned the Second Great Awakening, right? And there, again, there's this whole sort of cacophony of competing religious voices. And
right.
Imagine, I say imagine, but I mean, I guess we're still living in that era to some degree, insofar as they have any credibility at all, right? But like, where do you turn now, right? So you have all these different choices, and it's essentially like a choose your own adventure religion or something,
Yeah.
multiple choice. And so, that definitely is going to kind of, certainly for someone like Melville, right, it's going to cause some introspection. Like, how do you make the correct decision if you're really talking about, the fate of your own soul at the end of the day?
Right.
How do you navigate that?
Right. Well, and not just the fate of your own soul, like heaven, hell, or whatever, but how you navigate it, like you say, is critical, not just like after you die, but it's like in your life, which is some of these common themes are like having meaning, whether that's Ahab's meaning to catch the great white whale, or it's some other meaning that Ishmael is trying to find. That's a sort of common theme, is that we have to find some kind of meaning, and in so doing, that can kind of like make our life on earth sort of like transcendent and heaven on earth in a way, or it can turn it into hell, like it did for some people. It can destroy people. So yeah, that's what we're having to navigate now, especially because it's like starting from, then, or a little before then, sort of like what we call the modern era, there's no more authority. Like before that, there's always either the king, which is another parallel, by the way, is it's not just sort of like the fall of religion in the modern era, but also the fall of monarchies, where now, which I think is sometimes underappreciated, with a monarchical sort of life that we lived in for 1,000 or 2,000 plus years. You don't always agree with the king, but the king is an authority, and what that authority structure is. Whereas now, our democratic liberal society, and by democratic liberal, I don't necessarily mean those words like the Democratic Party or the Liberal Party. I mean in the society that we now have, where and you could even call it republic or whatever, but the point is that we're in a society or a civilization now where the individual is the authority, which is really, really great, but at the same time, most people aren't up for that responsibility. And since they aren't up for that responsibility, and this again kind of gets into some Nietzschean death of God stuff, in that when he saw the death of God that happened in the 19th century, which a lot of people misunderstand that, like he's making atheist statement, but if you're saying God died, that it also assumes that he was alive, and if you're saying that he was killed by us, that means that, well, you're speaking in mythological terms, because of course, if God was alive, he couldn't be killed by us, but it's that he was killed in our psyche. In other words, we went from a position to where the culture was surrendered to authority, whether it was religious or monarchical, to a position where everyone is the authority, and they don't always want that authority. But the reason I mention all that is because that's why we had a lot of the crazy stuff that happened in the 20th century as far as fascism, communism, and everything else, is because those were sort of the replacements for the religious and political structures that we had in the past. And the reason that this ties into what we're talking about is that the culture has been shifting from in the modern world, from one where it had a defined authority structure to where now the authority structure is on the individual. And the individual was personified in that sort of archetypal representation of religious figures like Christ, even Buddha in the East, but without that religious symbolism that we've kind of lost in the last at least 200 or 300 years. Now we're kind of like, at best, we're either Ishmael or an Ahab, unless we kind of like wake up and have that sort of new beginning like happen at the end of the story. And so that the Ishmael is just someone who's like searching for answers and kind of like wayward on that path to maybe find something from the cosmos that's going to give him a new beginning, a new lease on life, a new understanding on things like you get from the story. Or then Ahab is the one that kind of like wants to control everything. And that's kind of like the archetypal position of a modern person. But and by the way, this is why this is an important work to get into, is because we're not just like discussing a book, we're talking about, you know, modern culture and the modern individual. But what do you think?
Yeah, well, we're kind of going back
Yeah.
towards the beginning of what you said, right? So if we think again about the whale as the self,
Yeah.
you know, I think one thing, and maybe just to clarify what I said earlier about sort of this notion of religious redemption, right? Like if we look at Ishmael as this seeker character who's really looking for some form of faith in the world, it's clear to me that his answer doesn't end up being a conventional religious answer, right? So there's no sense in which any answer which is just given to you can be sufficient. And I would say, you know, even if you're talking about under a kingship or even under Catholicism or anything like that, I think it is this sort of self-delusion to think, you know, I mean, no matter how you sort of deny the responsibility, right? That's not the correct, quote unquote, correct answer, right? So it's a sort of a fleeing from your own responsibility as opposed to sort of arresting it.
Yeah, so basically it's like you have to well, you know, so I was talking to some people in a clubhouse room the other night, and we kind of got into the subject of originally we were talking about psychedelic kind of scientifically. I don't have really psychedelic experience. I have some religious experience and some sort of psychological experience, but you know, they would describe this experience of psychedelics, which are basically induced religious experiences, and they were getting in these like debates over what it was, or like some of the details, like, you know, the becoming one with the universe feeling, which is something that Melville describes a few times in Ishmael's journeys, being on the ship, or when the ship's wrecked, and all those kind of things. It's kind of like a cycle of unity with the cosmos. But then what was funny is one person was asking the girl who kind of gave that description, was like, so when you were watching yourself go through all this whole experience and becoming one with the universe, who was that watching it? So kind of like implying this division within the self, even though that there's, she's trying to imply a total unity of the self. But my objection to all that was that when you get into that sort of depth of experience, whether it's religious or psychedelic or psychological, you know, like Carl Jung's experiences, like with the Red Book, people want to say that that's psychedelic, but it's, or maybe religious, but it's his own psychological work. But you can't really describe it other than symbolically. And the more you try to, the more you lose what's really there. So all this is to say that the only way that we can kind of like know within that experience is to experience it, which is why it's important to have books like this that aren't too descriptive, and all you can do is experience them, and then you find the experience in the human experience. And that's why that the Edinger's description is really good, because it's a psychological formation rather than trying to get overly descriptive like some people try to do. But what do you think?
Yeah, so I want to go back to the notion of Ishmael as an unreliable narrator, because I think this is something which is so important to the book, in the sense that you're talking about lack of authority in the world, right? But you literally have an author that has no authority, right? Everything he says, you have to question. You don't know when he's kind of joking with you. You don't know when he's being serious. You know, sometimes it's very obvious, right? But the point is, he's not an authoritative voice in the same sense that you normally look for in a narrator, right?
Right.
So it is almost like being at sea, in the sense that like your legs, you have nothing solid to stand on, right?
Yeah, and almost like the culture, like we're talking about how the culture, well, like you just said a minute ago, it doesn't have definitive authority, but
yeah. And I think, you know, there's something arbitrary, but there's about the fact that, you know, coming back to the whale, right? And there's the significance of the whale in the story. You know, as Ishmael describes them, Moby Dick, or the whales in general, you know, it gets overloaded with all this imagery, right? And it becomes very godlike, right? He describes all these different characteristics he has. There's speculation that it's immortal. There's speculation that he's, you know, he's more intelligent than Pythagoras, and like, so all these sort of, so he's got his genius to him, right? And so there's a notion, all these notions of immortality, and you know, he's all places at all times, and all these different things get overloaded with this whale, right? And there's something arbitrary about selecting a whale as being the bearer of this symbol, right? But you know, and the arbitrariness of it, I guess, to me, it could have just as well been something else, but to me, it really just does symbolize the sort of seeking that Ishmael is doing, right? Because, like I said, whatever answer he comes up with, it can't be sort of a conventional answer. It really has to be his own answer, and so he's sort of latched on to this particular animal as having significance, but it could have been something else. And at the end of the day, it's not the animal per se that's important, right? It's what the animal represents and sort of what he's
Right.
bringing to the whole thing.
Well, yeah, to me, the whale is almost synonymous with a dragon, but the difference between a dragon and a whale is that a dragon is completely psychological or mythical, whereas a whale is something real. So like you can take the dragon metaphor and you can project that on almost anything. You can project it on corporations, or you can project it onto countries, or you can project it on certain things in nature, whether that's particular animals or particular forces like a hurricane or whatever, or just nature in general. But the interesting thing that makes a whale work so well, at least the way that I see it, is that it's very much like you can personify almost exactly the way that you do with a whale or with a dragon. But the whale, it's strange because it's so mythical in that, you know, especially back then in the 19th century when people barely had, you know, things like we do now with scuba and submarines and all that, you know, you only really saw parts of the whale, or you saw the whale when it was like caught and dead. You know, you never really saw the whole thing living hardly, which kind of gives it that extra mythical quality, but at the same time being real in the embodied world. But at the same time, it works too, just because one, it was really big at that time that people were whaling for the sake of oil. But what's interesting is it's carried over into the modern world, even like to today, 2021, where we're still trying to deal with our need for oil and trying to, you know, find other ways to power things, like literally. So, but those things are all things that we project onto. Like we project our need for power, like literally electricity, onto the world, whether that's oil fields or whales or whatever. It's like we have this insatiable need for power, both electrically and psychologically. And so, yeah, that's kind of what's represented there, I think. But I don't know. You probably have more thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, one thing I was going to say about the whale that's interesting is it definitely starts out as a real object, right? But it becomes increasingly freighted with this mythological symbolism as it goes on. And really it is Ishmael kind of building it into a sacred object really out of nothing.
Right.
So you can sort of think of it again as, you know, maybe we start in, you know, we'll just call it atheism, right? There are no gods in the world. But Ishmael himself is able to bring this godlike notion to the whale, which is not any different than what Ahab is doing, right? It's just Ahab sees it as a demonic figure, all right? Ahab sort of sees the injustice of the world, right? The fact that there's tragedy in the world. It's an essential element of the injustice of it all, right? And he's not able to reconcile himself to that. So, you know, that's an interesting way of contrasting the two, that they are both seeing the whale in these godlike terms, in ways that, you know, other characters in the story, interestingly, you know, they have their own attitudes towards the whale. And you mentioned projection, right? And so, I mean, it's a huge sort of topic to cover in Moby Dick in terms of projection. Edinger does talk about it. Again, it's something he doesn't talk about enough for my satisfaction personally. But, you know, you see it in lots of different ways. So, you know, you mentioned, for instance, the fact that, you know, just Ahab's Ahab's leg is made out of a whale bone, right?
Right.
And well, not only that, he's got this big white scar, basically
Right.
kind of tearing him in two. I almost imagine him like Two-Face from Batman or something. He's got he's literally kind of divided in two, and he's sort of in this mode of self-conflict also at the same time.
Right.
And the one half of his body really starts to take on this characteristics of more and more of Moby Dick itself, right?
Mm.
He's got all these whale-like characteristics. And in fact, I always point out too that Moby Dick, I mean, the popular misconception of Moby Dick is it's an albino whale.
Mm.
And it doesn't say that anywhere in the book. In fact, he's always called the white whale, right? But that's just kind of a nickname that's given to him. When he's actually described, he's talked about in terms of he's been it's this basically object of attack from all these whalemen for years and years and years. So he's got all these harpoons sticking in him. He's got scars running up his body, running up and down his body, and they're basically white scars, right? And so I think the reason I bring this up is because the mistake of thinking that Moby Dick is an albino misses all that symbolism, because it's really Ahab is becoming more and more like the whale as he goes on throughout the story. Mm. So he's actually basically it's this notion of projection that you're seeing all over again.
Yeah, and that split within Ahab, within the characters, within the whale, it makes me think so much of, again, how it projects / reflects, like within sort of like the cultural mythology. Like I think of how Europe had the Iron Curtain up until not that long ago, like just a little over 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It was kind of like that, sometimes described as that like split through sort of the modern culture physically until it came down. And that sort of represents how the world, as we come together and had to deal with our competing cultures, competing worldviews, competing religions, competing political views, and then we have to kind of merge those, and then there'll always kind of be these predominant two ways of looking at the world, which is one is more individualistic and one's more collectivistic or collective. And then the reality is that you don't ever want one, you want both. And I think that's a lot of what the whole story is getting at, both literally and as we talk about here in the book, psychologically, is that sort of back and forth between collectivism and then splits to the individual, and then splits within the individual is what it's all symbolizing. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you sort of mentioned the dichotomy between Ahab and Ishmael, right? Ishmael, I mean, in terms of he's the hero of the story, but there's significant moments in the story where he really, so, I was talking about how he disappears, but there's literal chapters where he sort of disappears. Mm-hmm. So, there's the famous quarterdeck chapter where Ahab comes out on the quarterdeck and he gives his speech, and he has everybody in his thrall, right? Except for Starbuck. So Starbuck is kind of the outlier. He's he shows some resistance, but basically nobody else really has any resistance to what's going on. And you would sort of expect, if Ishmael is really this heroic character, he would be the one sort of standing up and saying something, right? Mm. But there's this, in very subtle ways, there's this deep sense of shame that's communicated, right? Because he recognizes himself as having not stood up to Ahab.
Right.
So there is this notion of surrender, and you talked about the 20th century, right? And you probably know all the background of this, right? But there was this Melville revival that happened. It really was only after World War I that Moby Dick was sort of rediscovered and appreciated in a way that was not in Melville's own lifetime. It wasn't appreciated, right? It was
Right.
And it was really only in light of this notion of tyranny,
Right.
that everyone was thinking about after World War I, right?
Yeah.
People started to realize that it really is touching on these themes of authoritarianism, right? It's cast in a certain way, right? There's lots of political readings for this book.
Right.
And I think when we talk about the universalism of it, that's why I think it isn't strictly limited to any one particular reading, because Melville does sort of deal in these universals more than anything else, right? And so it's very easy to sort of read it on the one hand as sort of a warning against really what's this encroaching civil war that's happening.
Right.
But it's just as easily applicable to World War I, World War II,
The Cold War.
Yeah.
Yeah. World War I, World War II, the Cold War, Civil War might be a good place to end it for today. So, yeah, I think due to some of my issues getting a delivery and everything, we went a little bit long, and we'll do this again probably in about a month. I might do some clubhouse rooms on the subject too, but I wanted to do this kind of like as a overall intro for people, because when I generally talk about it, most people are kind of like, huh, why Moby Dick? There's still some people get it, but some people don't. But I'm glad we got into the themes where it's something applicable to understanding a lot of the modern movies that we try to understand, whether that's Star Wars or Matrix and some of these, and also just around psychology, and then the cultural things like we talked about, which are super, super important, because the better you can understand it through this kind of a lens, or this kind of a interpretation, the better that we can understand things aren't so straightforward. Like, people get into like weird political discussions all the time, and weird political debates they probably shouldn't, because they're like being a little bit overly one-sided. So yeah, it's been a really good big introduction to the subject. And then, like I said, yeah, we'll stay tuned, and we'll do probably a couple clubhouse rooms related, as well as a couple more podcasts like this, probably in about a month, and then a month after that. But yeah, Chad, do you have anything else to say as we wrap up before we go?
No, it's been fun. So I know I've jumped around a lot. I've always thought it's difficult to talk about Moby Dick without talking about the entire book all at the same time.
Right.
So yeah, there is a strong sense in which the end sort of implicates the rest of it, right?
Right.
So how do you just talk about the first whatever chapters? Right?
Yeah.
You really have to kind of link all the different things together, and then and then finally start to understand it as a bigger whole.
Right. Yeah, I know, that's good. That's why I'm glad we did it that way. And then that way, even though we went over an hour, it's still a good introduction. And then probably when we do this again in about a month, we'll get into some of the more the details of Edgar's book, and some things like that. And then like we did today, talk about how we can apply it to culture, our own lives, and again, even understanding other books and things, because I think it's a good, like I said earlier, if you can really get a good understanding of this book and the symbolism in it, then you can better understand, because like, even just as I try to like push for the Jungian way or whatever, it's not because there needs to be like a new Jungian dogma or whatever. It's just because it's like the universal human experience that you can apply to an individual life, a cultural life, a work of art, dreams, symbolism, all kinds of things, and then you better understand the world. So yeah, so thanks a lot, and just stay tuned, and yeah, we'll do more of these. Thanks a lot, Chad.
All right. Thanks, Isaac.
All right, take care.